Last episode, we chatted about how Nik Ehlers might be ready for a change of scenery, but is it too late to salvage the relationship? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, I want to start off with a topic sort of relevant to some of the comments from our last episode. And I've seen quite a bit of support here for Nik Ehlers, which I think is great because I think, back in the day, a lot of people used to focus on the things that he struggled with, which it's no secret that Ehlers isn't exactly a defensive wonderkind. And I think in a lot of ways, the way that he thinks about the game might be closer to like a European footballer, right? People often talk about him passing into open space and then he passes to no one. But the idea is that he actually trusts his teammates enough to be in those spots, to take advantage of that space and actually turn those chances into opportunities. If he had played European football, I think people would have a very different perception of how he sees the ice, because that's honestly the closest comparison I can think of. Now, like I said, he's got some deficiencies. He'll have harebrained moments, and I think it'd be incorrect to ignore those. And he's had moments where his game has fallen a step behind expectations. But overall, right, when it comes to guys who are like elite transition players and some of our fastest and most creative attackers, there's not many guys on this team that can really do what Nik does. In fact, the only person who might come close is perhaps Brad Lambert. Now, I want to talk about whether or not it's too late to repair the relationship between him and the Jets, because I have two minds of this, and I don't know that the answer is going to make you happy, but we'll be honest. Before we get into that, though, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Now, like I said, listen, the Jets are probably pretty much through with Ehlers. I think if it was a different situation where Nik was playing top-line minutes and, his relationship was maybe strained with one or two coaches at most, I could see things being different. But this has been years and years of tension that has built up. And Nik never really publicly complains about his role, but you always get the sense that he's a smart kid. He knows why I call him kid. He's a veteran at this point. He's 28, so can't really call him a kid anymore, even though he still strikes you as a very young player. But Ehlers is smart. He knows this market. He knows what he's kind of worth. If there's a player who probably follows stats and keeps up with that stuff, Nik would probably be one of them, just because I think he just thinks about these things. And the way that he sees the ice is fundamentally different than how a lot of other players do. I think he's a very high IQ, very creative player. And sometimes, that might be why Scheifele hasn't always preferred to play with him, which, again, I think you run into a situation where, from Winnipeg's perspective, you've got an asset who is clearly not a third liner, but for some reason just hasn't been able to convince coaches that he's more than that. And so at this point, I don't think that the relationship is really salvageable. The one thing I will say is that Arniel's coming in. He's already shown that he'll play Ehlers quite a bit more and perhaps in one of the most key positions on the team. And he does seemingly make good use of it. I mean, we saw Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde absolutely shred the league when they were united earlier this past season. And so I don't want to completely write it off, because I feel like saying that there's a 0% chance that Ehlers comes back, it's disingenuous and it's not true. But here's where I'm kind of at. I think it's probably 85% Ehlers is gone, especially if the Jets are rumored to be shopping him. I know that Pignota isn't exactly the most reliable source, but when it comes to Friedman and some of the other guys suggesting similar sorts of trains of thought, I have a hard time seeing that being a coincidence, right? I don't think that there's sometimes where there's smoke, there is legitimate fire. And I think this is one of those cases. Now, like I said, I think that there is a scenario where Ehlers does return, but like you'd have to undo like years of a sour relationship. And I don't know that I really see that, right? Like Scheifele may not really enjoy playing with Ehlers. And if Nik knows that, then, it's not really a strong endorsement from your teammate. And to have the coaching staff also overlook you, to me, Nik's best decision is probably to go for a change of scenery. But what is somewhat interesting in all of this is that Ehlers himself is not really asking for a trade. I know that he is probably aware of his contract situation and knows that he's only got a year left, but by now, if he was really like trying to escape, he probably would have put that request in already. If it really hasn't happened and he's been patient, for one thing, I think it speaks to his character. I think that he gets a lot of crap from Jets fans, but I think when I look at players who are really loyal to this franchise and who have honestly gone through the work without really complaining about it and who have generally been pretty accountable about their level of play, Ehlers is a surprisingly harsh critic of himself. He actually checks off a lot of those boxes. For one thing, he doesn't really talk about leaving the Jets. He doesn't really make open overtures to other teams. And honestly, when it comes to his own performance, he's like, even in good games, he like tears himself apart. And so it should have been a fit for the Jets. Like, this would have been a guy that in normal circumstances you would have thought would be a fan favorite, but because of how he is, and I guess the way that a lot of fans see the game these days, he's fallen out of favor. And at this point, I struggle to see a scenario where he continues on with the Jets. And I don't want to write it off and say it's impossible, but like, look at the reality of the situation, right? Ehlers is probably on the way out. I don't think he wants to really stick around with a team that he feels doesn't value him enough. And if that's the case, all you can hope is that you get a half decent return. But I mean, given the quality of his play and what he brings to this team and how important he is, especially when it comes to 5v5 creation, I just don't know how you get an equal return. I mean, you're talking about a guy who on most teams would be in your top 6. I don't know if he's going to be like an elite first-line winger for most teams, but I'll tell you what, he was part of one of the best Jets lines in history, and this past season, one of the top lines in the NHL. The only line that I think was outscoring this unit was like the McKinnon line and maybe McDavid or something when they were playing. So all that to say that it's going to be a tough loss, and I really wish that it hadn't come to this, but I think at this point, asking for the situation to turn around is probably, a bit of a fool's errand. But I welcome and love to be wrong. I want to be wrong. Like, this is one of those scenarios where I would kill to be wrong, but I just don't see how this situation and relationship really repairs. But hey, I'm open to being surprised, and maybe the Jets have something in mind with Ehlers that catches us all off guard. Now, Winnipeg also kind of has some deliberations to make with the depth lines, which, it's certainly not as important as the Ehlers conversation, but it is also something worth talking about because I think there's a couple of guys who might deserve more of a look elsewhere in the lineup. We'll talk about that and who that might be in just a quick moment. Before we go too much further, though, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at Game Time. When it comes to buying tickets, a lot of you know how much it is a pain in the butt buying, tickets from most vendors. You get hit with surprise fees, charges, and sometimes when you're even buying these really expensive tickets, you buy them blind. You don't even know where you're sitting. You might get a section assignment or whatever, and you can see the row and seat number, but guess what? You don't know what the view is like. Game Time totally gets your frustration, and that's why they offer you killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, and even views from your seats, all backed by their lowest price guarantee and event cancellation protection. It's why they've become, one of the top resellers of NBA tickets, and they can help you get NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time actually go down the closer you get to tip-off, which, for those of you who like saving time and money, it is a fantastic option. If you're like me and you want to take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets, go with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just chatting through some very interesting questions. The Ehlers episode yesterday was kind of, I wouldn't say controversial, but I think certainly a lot of folks had many different feelings about it. Most of us, though, I think are pretty aligned in the fact that trading Ehlers feels like a loss for the Jets. Regardless of what they get in return, he offers some unique skill sets that they're just not likely to get back. So whatever they do get in return is going to have to be pretty darn good. Now, I want to talk about some other positions, especially more in the depth forward ranks, because I feel like that is an overlooked conversation point. But there's some guys down there in the bottom six that I think are really worth chatting about. Before we dive into that and why perhaps guys like Morgan Barron have maybe been a little overlooked, just wanted to let you know that for all of you Fox Sports or ESPN watchers, if you find yourself having to turn down the volume because there's just too much shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, I want to focus a little bit for a moment on some of the depth lines for the Jets. Look, Winnipeg is not a team that I think has traditionally been defined by like elite top-end talent. Winnipeg is mostly a team that's kind of like a team that's really relied on depth. Up and down your lineup, you have lots of good skill, even if it's not game-breaking talent. But because you have lots of skilled depth, it has at times papered over some of the lack of like higher-end elite talent. And some of those guys I look at as perhaps deserving bigger roles this upcoming season. One guy that I kind of circle back to a lot, and I've talked about him before, it's Morgan Barron. Like Barron for me is one of those players who's surprisingly underappreciated for a dude who had like 10-plus goals playing like 9 minutes a night. Morgan is a very interesting guy because early to the start of the season, he sort of looked okay. But over the course of the year, I think he really carved himself out a very good niche on that fourth line. But I think with him, you kind of get the sense that there's more to his game. He's got some pretty good shooting ability. He's got the ability to drive the net effectively. And at times, he'll be a real force along the walls and on the forecheck. And you sort of wonder, if you give him more prime deployments, if you put him in a position where he is elevated in importance, maybe like a third line deployment or something, would you start to yield results out of that? And I'm not saying that you want to replace Niederreiter with Barron. I don't know that that's really an equivalent exchange, and perhaps it would actually hurt the Jets more than it helps. But I think in terms of guys who I could see maybe stepping up in the absence of some other players who made a part, Barron is one that I've circled on the list for a while. He looks really impressive. I think he's grown a lot since coming to the Jets. And in terms of like an everyday sort of NHLer who brings some really solid scoring depth and perhaps has the ability to generate even more, his name is one that I've kind of circled back to a few times mentally. Another guy that I kind of wonder about is David Gustafsson. Gustafsson's a little more on the fringe of the Jets org than Barron is. I tend to think Barron is very well liked. I think that he's trusted a lot. Gustafsson has sort of been more of a bubble player. And David is kind of interesting because from his Moose days, I always felt that he had a lot more skill and pop to his game than ever really translated at the NHL level. It feels like whenever he came up to the Jets, something was missing in his game. And I don't know if it was just transition, if it was defensive awareness, his lack of offensive creation. I mean, there's like a whole host of things that for me held him back a little bit in Winnipeg's youth and prospect rankings. But towards the back half of this season, when he came back and started taking over some games, I kind of got to thinking about whether or not there's more to his game than perhaps people acknowledge. I'm not sitting here saying that you've got a second line or first line center waiting there, but maybe he's at some point ready to take on the 3C mantle, right? If you could get Lowry into a second line or like a second, third line deployment, right? You have two third lines. That could be really devastating for a lot of teams. I know most people would say that, Adam is probably an elite fourth liner. Honestly, I kind of think he's better than that. I think that's really not giving him enough credit for how good he's been the last year or two. And I don't want to say that he scores at the rate of a guy who plays as much as he does, because I feel like he does kind of not finish enough opportunities. But in terms of all the other stuff, Adam's kind of a beast. And so if you had a 1-2 punch of Gustafsson and Lowry, more so Lowry probably taking the extra share of minutes here once in a while, I think that could be a very intriguing thing. And if you give Gustafsson skill to work with, I think that there's more of a player there than perhaps people have previously acknowledged. And I'm not sitting here saying that Gus is going to be a beast. I know I've joked, or perhaps even some has seriously said in the past, maybe one day he could become a second line center. That was, mostly fantasy and probably not me being all that serious. But I do think that there's a real chance for him to sort of grow into a role where he plays with skill and he's able to be a stabilizing force while also just being a machine in terms of his forechecking ability and his relentless drive to hound puck carriers. So there is a version of him that I'm interested in seeing, but it would kind of take the Jets acknowledging that his role probably needs to change and that he has to play more with skill. And I don't know if that's where Winnipeg's mentally at yet. They could be at some point, but I tend to think that they look at him as like a third or a fourth liner, and so there he stays. Again, it could change at some point, and maybe even it will, but I think as of right now, he's mostly been pigeonholed more into like the fourth line, forechecking, hard-hitting role, which, again, I ain't going to complain about. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I just think from what I want from him and from what I think he would benefit from, it'd be better for him to get the chance to really grow as an NHLer. And if he actually starts to put 2 and 2 together, that would be fantastic. I think he's shown that he's getting there and that his game has grown significantly since he first joined Winnipeg. But there's still a fair few number of things where I think he's perhaps a step behind his peers. And I don't mean that as an insult. I just think realistically, the barrier and bar of entry at this level of the league is crazy high nowadays. And so players like Gustafsson really have to add more versatility than just being good at forechecking and PKing. You've got to be a real creative force, and that's where I think Gus has shown flashes of starting to get there. But it will take time for him, and it probably doesn't happen, this coming year. But something to think about. He and Barron, I think, are very unheralded. I think that there's some legit pop to their games that I think could potentially increase with the right skill and perhaps an increase in their responsibility. But, you also don't want to like overburden them. And I think perhaps that's a question for another time. But sort of on the vein of players who could do with, maybe a change of scenery or something, or perhaps the Jets should look into swapping out. One guy that I've sort of thought about is Kyle Connor. And I like watching Kyle Connor in a lot of ways, but there are also moments where his game has really frustrated me over the years. And it wasn't until recently that I saw some growth in the way that he approached his shifts that was great to see, but perhaps a little bit belated. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up with some thoughts on perhaps one of the biggest questions that I think a lot of us have. Obviously, Ehlers, that trade is kind of a real bummer, and I think a lot of us are not looking forward to it. But I think if you're Winnipeg, right, there's one other player on this team, and somebody brought it up in the comments, and I thought that's why it would be really good to talk about it. It's Kyle Connor. He's expiring in not too long here, and with that contract kind of coming to an end pretty soon, I think Winnipeg has a very difficult decision to make, right? Is he going to be a guy that you keep around and really build around, or do you kind of see him as maybe a player who doesn't really stick around for much longer? I don't want to say that Connor is overrated because I think he adds some legitimately top-end talent in finishing that the Jets don't have a lot of. I think Winnipeg legitimately has struggled to find players who are elite finishers and elite creators at 5v5. And in that respect, look, like no one can really dispute the fact that Connor is one of the best scorers on the team. He is phenomenal. And when he's actually playing at a high level, he can be a real force on this team. But I think the biggest question and problem with him is that it takes a while for him to get into that state. We've seen him on shifts where it just feels like he's more of a defensive liability and stuff than you'd like him to be. And I think that has been a constant source of frustration. I think for a lot of Jets fans, people have kind of begun to turn on him a little bit. And I don't know if I'm necessarily in that camp, although I have admittedly been pretty critical of him over the years. I think I'm sort of sitting here thinking the Jets need a lot of help in a lot of different positions. And Connor, while he is an awesome player at finishing goals, getting him into those positions to score has been a legitimate challenge. And so would it make sense to part ways with him while he still has plenty of trade value and you bring in some other pieces that can really help you? And I think that's a very difficult question because, I don't want to say that he deserves to get traded. I don't think that's really fair. I think if I'm looking at Winnipeg and what I want them to do, I want them to make a smart, informed choice that makes the most sense for the roster and where the team is at. And Winnipeg right now is kind of in a state where there's a ton of gaps, and removing Connor will hurt this team. There's zero question that he, with the right line combinations, can be a great force. We saw him really grow his game at times during the postseason where he was like forechecking aggressively. He was really engaged. It was a different Kyle Connor than we're used to seeing. But is that enough to really push me to want to keep him around? I don't know. I enjoy watching him when he scores, but when he's not, it is a different experience. And when he's not scoring, I just don't know. What is he really bringing in an average game? And it's hard to really define that and say that I've been impressed with some of his efforts over the years. But I still think there is a version where he continues to be an important contributor on this team and plays well. But I just, for what Winnipeg needs, he kind of is a little bit of a luxury player. And I think the Jets might be better off changing him out for some guys who can really push this team forward and get the squad into a better competitive state, right? I think the Jets have a lot of needs. I think Connor would generate one of the biggest trade returns of any player on this team. And with his contract expiring in a year or so, I just look at this and I think to myself, is he really the guy that you want to keep as part of this future core? And maybe the Jets do actually intend to re-sign him. I'm not sure if that's the best outcome because I think he's going to be really expensive. And I have some questions about how long you can keep doing this at a high level. But, the other part of me sits here and I'm like, I get it though, right? Like I get why you would want to keep him and retain him and re-sign him. But I don't know if that makes the most sense long term. And so you always run into this kind of tight position of wanting to be loyal to a point, but also realizing that sometimes you've just got to move on. And with Connor, great player, lots of fun watching him. He's good at the things Kyle Connor is good at, and sometimes that's not always what the Jets need. But I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this. I know some people have sort of had similar thoughts. Somebody on last episode was talking about the fact that between Connor and Ehlers, Connor should be the one that's on the market. And I wish I could disagree, but I do think that is probably a fair assessment. I think Connor has sort of gotten to, the state of him being as good as he's ever going to be. And at this point, the only thing forward for him is probably an eventual decline. We've seen him struggle at times recently, and I don't think that's going to get better. So, it's a tough position because on the one hand, he's a great player and a great scorer, and losing him is only going to hurt you more at times. But by the same token, the Jets need to move on and be ready to embrace a better, more skilled, and more balanced future. And Connor might be a really big piece that helps you get there. So let me know how you're feeling about that in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with even more Jets coverage, so don't go anywhere. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.